everyone, and welcome to Boss Level, the show where we discuss and demystify AWS technologies and services that you can use on your cloud game development journey. My name is Chris Melissinos, and I'm the principal evangelist for the video game industry here at AWS. And I'm joined here today with my co-hosts, Dominic Mills, Gabriel Batista, Karthik Odapally, and making her first appearance on Boss Level, Senior Solutions Architect and awesome fellow gamer, Gena Gizzi. Yay, Gena!
Hey, thank you.
Of course. And on today's episode, we are going to explore some best practices for a common issue when launching a highly anticipated game, a game that may have a viral pop at launch, or for any game that sees a spike in players due to an in-game event. In all of these cases, it's important to make sure that you're prepared for that surge of players, which can be critical to the reception of your game. But how do you know what to scale, how much to scale it, how to make sure everything goes smoothly? On today's episode, we're going to discuss techniques and services like cloud governance and visibility, estimating concurrent users or CCUs, scaling infrastructure, monitoring demand during your game launch, and more that can help you weather the demand for your awesome game. But before we jump in, let's talk about what we have been playing. So let's go ahead and have our first new participant, Gena. Gena, what are you playing right now? Like, what has you really enraptured as far as games go?
Minecraft is my favorite game, probably of all time. So I've been playing that a lot, but also I'm slowly making my way through Pikmin 2, which is very challenging and hard and scary.
Can I show you the shirt that I just so happen to be wearing today?
No way.
For those of
that
for
was
those
not
who
planned.
This is not planned. Oh my gosh. So for those who aren't watching the visuals, I have a Pikmin shirt where the little Pikmin are carrying the pocket away. It looks like the little embroidered Pikmin are carrying the pocket. I love it. I just got the shirt and I wore it for this episode because I was excited about games, and you just brought up Pikmin. That's amazing.
And Pikmin 2 is so good. Really leaned into everything that was great about Pikmin 1 and just completely amped everything up. Oh, that's a good pull. A good classic pull. Very cool. All right, Dominic, what are you playing right now? Aside from Pikmin, which you're going to go and start playing now.
I know, right? Like, I was going to say I will start playing Pikmin now, but actually what I've been playing recently is this game called Echoes of the Plum Grove. And it's a farming sim, but with a bit of a twist that I haven't seen before, which is your character can actually like pass away from disease or old age. So you need to like make sure that you have heirs so that you can kind of like continue your farm onto the next generation. So it's a really nice twist on the farming sim genre. And I've been really enjoying it. It also has kind of the same visual style as like maybe Paper Mario, where there's like 2D sprites in like a 3D environment. So that's also really fun. I've been digging it so far.
All right, Gabriel.
Ooh, okay. So I am a huge first-person shooter fan. And X Defiant just released last week. So I have been playing that religiously. I will say that it brings me back to the days of Call of Duty Modern Warfare. The game is very streamlined, let's say. So you run around really quick, you respawn really quick, everybody is bunny hopping all across the map. So it really moves away from that like realistic military sim feeling and back to like those arcadey feels of, 2010-ish first-person shooters.
Mm-hmm.
I'm loving it. I feel like a child again. I've been playing it nonstop, and I'm super excited for all of the new maps and weapons and everything that's going to be coming out with the updates.
Very cool. Plus, you're in the middle of a move, you said. So now we get to see behind. We get to peek behind the curtain here, right? I see your board game collection behind you. Catan popping straight out of there in the back.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Next episode, this is all going to be blurred out, and you will never see it again.
No. We love it. We love it. It's real life, buddy. It's real life. Karthik, how about you?
Hey, Chris. I have been playing on the Apple Arcade. There's a game called Retro Bowl. It's a very old game that Apple, or the studio that remastered it for the Apple Arcade platform, for American football. That's what it is, Retro Bowl. It's American football with like stick figures kind of thing. Very 8-bit graphics-y kind of game, but it's really addictive on the phone. And on the console, I placed an order for Sea of Stars. It's a turn-based RPG game for the Nintendo Switch.
Yeah.
So I think I should be getting that today. So I'm going to put in some time in that one. And from the Mario franchise, Paper Mario 1,000-Year-Old Door is out. I'm yet to get it. So I'm waiting on that as well.
Have you played it before, Karthik?
Yes.
Okay.
The Paper Mario one before I played, but not the 1,000-Year-Old that came going. Was it the Game Boy one?
GameCube, I think.
GameCube. Yeah.
I did not play that. So this is new for me.
Good. Oh my gosh. The whole series is just amazing. And also a physical games guy, right? So you said you're waiting for it to show up. So still buying those carts. Good. As a collector, I agree.
Either that or his download speeds are just really, really slow.
Yeah, that could be to get your ass in the office and start downloading from the network. For me, I've been playing Monopoly Go. Yeah, I have kind of this off again, on again relationship with mobile games. Monopoly Go is just the perfect amount of Monopoly, the perfect amount of, oh my goodness, things are happening and exploding all over the screen. This looks amazing. And just a really good, tight kind of a gameplay loop. So been playing a bit of that. I've been going back and playing Fallout 4 as a result of the Smash TV series that was produced right here at Amazon. And Dave the Diver, I'm going back and playing through because I hadn't really played through it before. So I got a few there. And I'm still working on my Pico 8 games and Picotron stuff, which of course I love, right? Okay, so in this episode, we're talking about what happens when, there's such a demand to play your game that goes beyond maybe what you had considered as a game developer, or there's kind of a, massive in-game event that's happening that's bringing in a flood of players simultaneously that you may not have accounted for. So understanding how to go ahead and position yourself, position your company, position the game to best handle those types of events is critically important to not just the kind of rollout of your game, but about the trust that you have with your players, right? So we're going to go ahead and dive into some, again, techniques and services that a game developer should be aware of as they're going ahead, again, bringing their online game out, and things to be aware of with regard to those type of pop events. So the first question I really want to talk about is cloud governance, not governments, governance. So Gabe, let's go ahead and talk a bit about that. So understanding what you have deployed to determine what you will need to be prepared to scale for sudden demand is really important. So how do game customers really get the right visibility into their workloads on AWS to determine what it is that they're using?
Yeah, Chris, you nailed it. It's really hard for you to walk around in the dark and get anything done, right? So understanding what's going on in your accounts, setting up the right levels of observability into the services that you have running, into the health of your workloads. These are all going to be critical for you to have a successful launch and for you to be able to scale out to the size that your game requires. One key piece that I really want to bring up first and foremost is tagging strategies. I feel like tags are something that are very easily overlooked. Most, if not all, AWS services, as you're creating the services, you're deploying a cluster or you're creating an instance. Typically at the end of that deployment wizard, there is an option for you to add tags, key value tags to these resources. Now, most customers look at those and they think, okay, this is going to help me remember what this instance is. It might not be a big deal for one thing or another thing. And then you keep building and you end up finding yourself in a place where you have, multiple dozens of instances running and multiple databases and S3 buckets, and you don't remember what's going on. With the tagging strategies, not only will it help you kind of understand that spaghetti of services that might be going on in your account, but it enables you to turn on a bunch of really useful features in other places inside of your console. A few of them that come to mind are things like cost allocation tags. This is a way for you to take a particular tag. Let's say that you have a project, right? You have your game. And you tag all of the resources that are related to that game with a specific tag. You can now go and look at the cost of your game, at the cost of just that specific resource, and be able to start building out reports and charts for you to understand what's going on. In addition, you're also able to start doing things like setting alarms against your different resources, or grouping them into a single view for you to be able to manage related resources as your project continues to grow.
But Gabe, have you come across customers who have not done the due diligence in tagging? Like, there could be so many teams involved. What if somebody forgot to tag, or just fat fingered it saying next to just clear the cluster? Any coaching on that for the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. That happens all the time. And let me tell you that it is significantly easier for you to set up a tagging strategy early on and kind of build as you go along than it is for you to have a giant environment and then have to go back and try to attach a bunch of tags. Now, obviously, a big piece of this is having your developers understand when to add tags, how to add tags, having some kind of standardization across the team. And this can be enforced depending on the services that you're using. In a previous episode, we spoke about a service called Control Tower, which uses another service called AWS Organizations. Now, these are services that help you to manage multiple AWS accounts. These services have the ability for you to set tagging to enforce tagging strategies, right? So you can ensure that if somebody comes in and they're just fat fingering through the wizard and trying to deploy something without a proper tag, that it won't let them until they go back and they add the necessary tags, so that you can ensure that everything is in place when the time is right and you actually need to leverage those tags, they'll be there for you.
Yeah, I feel like every time I have a customer conversation where they're like trying to get more visibility into something, understand the cost of something or what they have deployed, it's like tags is the first place I go. And that's almost always where, there's a gap. And they're like, man, I wish we had kind of established this strategy earlier on so that we weren't at this point now. And now like going back and scrambling to find this data. It really is like one of the first things that I would kind of set up if I were to say, hey, here's like a new project that we're going to be doing, or we're starting an AWS environment. Like, tagging strategy's got to be at the top of the list.
No one wants to do it at first, but they definitely regret it later. So start now before it's too late.
Gena, you bring up such an important point, right? Because across a wide variety of tools that any developer uses, right? Not just developer, anybody using systems, right? Making sure that stuff is tagged correctly. Yes, it can feel arduous and feel like a real pain, but it can save so much time and headache if you have that information set up correctly and you adhere to a good process of making sure that you are tagging as much as you can, as accurately as you can. So when an issue happens, you're able to quickly find the information you need and be able to go ahead and resolve it, or understand a class of things that need to be taken into consideration. So yes, much like anything else, right? Humans are the weakest, link in that chain, right? So if you are standing up your studio, you're standing up your dev environment and your dev teams, insist upon proper tagging of everything from your code repository all the way back to these types of services that you operate, right?
And if you wait too long, yeah, you're so right, Gabe. And if you wait too long, it can be a really huge culture shift for your development teams. I mean, if they're used to operating one way and all of a sudden you're enforcing standards that are brand new to them, it's going to take some time for them to get used to that change. So better to start sooner than later.
Absolutely. Completely agree.
In the areas where tagging strategies and enforcement doesn't work, putting off my SA hat and putting on the finance hat, what's the old adage saying? Follow the money. So if you've customers who have access to Cost Explorer or their own finance dashboards internally, right? Anybody who quote forgot to tag, you can actually follow the money and see which accounts are provisioning infrastructure that have not been correctly. So we have had customers follow the money and find out the perpetrators, for lack of a better word, on who did not follow the tagging mechanisms.
Yep. And speaking of accounts, there's actually another area that I really want to call out here, and that's multi-account strategies, or splitting your game across different accounts as you're building things out, right? So just like the tagging strategy is something that you want to do early because it becomes significantly more difficult down the line, separating your workloads into dedicated accounts is something else that you should be doing early and often. by the time you get around to releasing your game and all the scaling problems that may come along with it, you really need to be able to understand, not only what's being deployed, but how the resources are being used.
Right.
For those that are not familiar, AWS has a concept of service quotas. So when you create a new account, there are these limits that are placed in the account to ensure that somebody new to AWS isn't going to go in and spin up some gigantic monstrosity and accidentally, bankrupt themselves off of running some super instance and forgetting about it. Because of that, when you use the multi-account strategies, what ends up happening is that each account has its own set of service quotas. So now you can better control how those resources are being used. And I'll give you a quick example of what I mean here. If you have both your production and your development in place, and let's say that you're running some EC2 instances in your development, right, to maybe build a game, build a client, whatever it may be, those resources, that service quota is getting eaten up, and it's being shared along with production. So by the time you go and you release your game and you think, hey, I'm going to be able to scale up to, I'm just making up numbers here, 20 instances, but in reality, 10 of those instances are being eaten up by development, you're going to find yourself in a weird spot. You're going to start getting all kinds of errors saying, hey, we can't scale out any wider. And it's because your resources are getting used somewhere else and you're not even aware of it. So that's definitely a big one to think about as you're prepping for your game release.
And it was a great point. I was saying also that's a great point. We did a prior episode on how you manage multi-accounts, right, on AWS. So definitely go back and listen to the incredible tips and tricks that our experts here put together for you. Dominic, you were going to add something there before we moved on.
I mean, before the beautiful shameless self-plug, I just want to stress that this isn't a problem that like quote unquote small studios like don't have to worry about either, right? A lot of the spirit of today is talking about what to do, like how to prepare for when your game explodes, whether you're expecting it to or not, right? So these are all strategies that you need to or should really think about and highly consider implementing, even if you're not expecting huge numbers, because it's exactly when you're not expecting the big numbers of players and the high concurrency to come in that you fall down, right? When you're not prepared for it. So just want to really stress that point. Like, don't think that any studio is immune to these problems.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. All right. So tips on enforcing a proper tagging strategy. Let's go ahead and talk a bit now about how to go ahead and effectively estimate things like concurrent users or CCUs, right? And how does that translate to throughput for your application? So Dominic, maybe you want to lead us off on this discussion, right? Again, how do you effectively estimate concurrent users? And by the way, I should also preface by saying, a lot of developers that have been around for a while, building games like, I know what user base for this type of game looks like. And I know what these envelopes kind of look like based on past history. But we can't rely on those things anymore because we have more people playing more games across more devices, reaching more diverse audiences than ever before. So understanding how to effectively estimate what those concurrent users could look like, it has incredible ramifications in everything from the stability of your game to the cost of operating those things. So why don't you go ahead and lead us into some of the discussion around how to effectively estimate those CCUs?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I feel like, I don't want to bury the lead, and I think you were already kind of alluding to this, right? But accurately estimating CCU is kind of a myth. I don't even know if it's a widely perpetrated myth, but it's definitely not something that you can rely on. And I'm sure every single one of us talking today has some war stories about, when one of our customers got more traffic than intended and services started falling over because the studio didn't prepare or expect as much traffic as they got, which is obviously a great problem to have. And I think you mentioned it right at the beginning of the episode, Chris, but being able to actually accept the traffic in and serve the players, right? Like actually have the players play your game has huge ramifications, especially when it's like a big launch event, right? Just again, putting on the business hat a little bit, it really does affect the like lifetime value of the players and of your entire game, right? You're basically, if you have launch issues, you're kind of hamstringing yourself and starting at like a lower high number, where, you know, you see a lot of games kind of trail off during its lifetime. Not all games. Lots of different game models these days that are kind of changing,
and some games come back, like Fallout 76, right?
There you go. But my point with all of this is that having a successful launch, really, really important. And estimating CCU is hard, if not impossible problem. So like, if you don't have the initial number to like work backwards from, then how do you actually do this? Mm-hmm. And the answer is really, you know, you have to be prepared to scale. And that's why cloud is kind of this awesome solution for this problem, right? Is because it actually lets you scale dynamically to answer changes in state that you can't predict beforehand. So lots of methods of trying to estimate CCU, especially if you've been around a long time and, you know, you think you have a good idea of what your player base is, your potential market, you know, other games that are in a similar genre that might have gotten similar. You just never know these days, right? Especially with like social media and things going viral. We do have a couple tips though, right? You've got big error bars. So rather than lowballing, you'd rather highball, right? If there's something that can't scale dynamically for whatever reason, better to pre-provision it at a higher rate, right? Pay a little extra for a short amount of time, right? We're usually talking like the span of a couple of days. And that is typically going to be way, way worth it if that potential traffic does come. And if it doesn't come, if the numbers are kind of within an expected range, then great. You can tone it down after a couple of days, right? When you think that danger has passed. But always safer to highball rather than lowball. I don't know. Does anyone here have any like fun stories about, you know, customers that they've had at launch? I see Gabe smiling. I see Gena smiling a little bit.
Yeah, I will say that the number one landmine that customers I've worked with tend to run into is the service quotas that we were talking about, because we have a lot of services that will auto scale and they'll kind of take some of that weight off of you, right? They will take care of growing bigger as you need it. But what a lot of customers tend to forget is that service quota ceiling still exists, right? And the secret here is that service quota doesn't cost anything. Like having the ability to scale out into much larger numbers doesn't cost you anything until you actually scale to those numbers. So as you're preparing for your game launch, you should go ahead and up those service quotas significantly higher than you think you're going to need, because again, you're not paying for that. It just gives the systems the ability to go to that level if it's needed.
Yeah. And go ahead, Gena.
No, I was just going to say that another common challenge that I see, like working with games customers day in and day out, is it can be really difficult to understand how CCU directly relates to throughput and load for your backend services, right? So like, let's say you want to be able to support 1 million CCU for your game launch. How does that relate to the expected load for a leaderboard that you have? It might be pretty straightforward for login because you're going to be expecting 1 million people to log in to your game. But when it comes to leaderboard or matchmaking or friends or any of your other backend services, it can be kind of challenging to understand how CCU maps to expected throughput.
Yeah, and that's going to lead us to our second T of today. Our second favorite one after tagging is testing, right, everyone? Yeah, but like actually, like scale your game beforehand, right? Whatever way you can, try and put load onto the systems and scale up those services to that kind of like high watermark that you might not even expect to get to, but you want to be able to handle if you get there, right? And that's going to reveal all sorts of like little cracks and things that you didn't predict beforehand, that you didn't foresee. Maybe service quotas, maybe the database that's powering your leaderboards, maybe that it doesn't scale in the way that you want, right? So testing is absolutely I know critical. It's again not like It's critical. It's not like maybe the most fun, exciting topic, but it's so critical. And like you want to have a successful game.
All right. So I have a quick example for you from back before we had the days of auto provisioning, all of this cloud magic that's out there, and the difficulty of understanding consumer behavior, player behavior. So I won't give away this very, very successful, very, very large MMO that came out years ago and is still alive today. But I remember when it launched, and this is in the era where you are basically co-locating stuff and you're building your own racks and creating your own hardware in. And the launch was so successful that the company had to pull the retail product off the shelf for a month because they could not get servers purchased and installed fast enough to handle demand. So literally they had to cap the player base and just had all this pent-up demand. Now, that doesn't really fly today, right? As everybody moves to the cloud, you want to make sure that you are, kind of going into this endeavor saying, look, I am going to be a hit. I need to think about, what happens if we are wildly successful. And the earlier you can have that consideration baked into your development and your launch plan, the better off you will be when that does happen. Right. And, other games like we saw Among Us, right, have something like 1,800 MAUs for like 2 years. And then the pandemic hit and they went to something like 60 million MAUs in like 3 months. Now, fortunately, lightweight enough back end and enough resources and available help to make sure that continued moving. But that could have been disastrous, right? It wasn't, fortunately, for them, but it can be. And so having the right planning, understanding the resources that you're using, making sure that you're testing, as Dominic said, making sure that you are estimating higher than you believe will serve you better in the long run.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to say earlier was leveraging the beauty of the cloud. We talked about service quotas, we talked about testing, and Gena, you're going to talk about it more, about fault injection, chaos engineering, and things like that. The other dimension to that, especially for large game customers who have global footprint, is regionalizing their services. So let's say we have a flood of traffic coming into the Americas, right? Having your services that rely on not just US East, but also US West, or in the EU, taking advantage of EU East and EU West and Tokyo and Singapore in the APAC. Like regionalizing your services to the nearest data centers definitely helps in the situation where, let's say, because of something going viral, now your traffic is 40% more than what you projected your max capacity would be. Then the spillover, like if you use services like AGA or Route 53 and things like that, we can work and build this infrastructure that can route traffic to nearby regions, so we don't just hammer one endpoint in one region. There's so many dimensions to look at it. Again, going back to testing, these are things that customers would need to test and see which one makes sense for them.
Can we just take a second and appreciate how much easier the cloud has made launching games? Can you imagine launching a game, something like Among Us, right? A very small game that went huge, and now having to purchase servers across the entire world to support customers across the entire world, and how long that takes, how expensive that is. It's just, I think, at least for me, I think sometimes I take it for granted how easy it is for me to spin up a server anywhere in the world at the click of a button, and that I forget that, this wasn't always the option that people had. Like you had to go buy servers.
That's why I have this old sticker of AWS: friends don't let friends build data centers.
There you go.
And I would be remiss if I didn't add, it's also important to pick the right cloud provider to ensure that you can reach your customers anywhere in the world on any device that they choose, right, when connecting to your games. So, all right, so now we've looked at tagging. We've looked at making sure you overestimate for the users that you're going to have, and some tips and tricks on how to go ahead and do that effectively and make sure that you're monitoring that. So over time, you understand the behavior of your base. So when it comes time to have a big, massive in-game event, you'll be more confident in the level of services that are going to be required for your players to go ahead and jump in and engage in bringing more players into your environment. But, all right, let's go ahead and talk about, how developers can scale on AWS for such events, right? So again, we We know the thresholds to look for. We know what to kind of scale. But Gena, why don't you walk us through how developers, once again, can scale on AWS for such amazing events?
Of course. Yeah. Like you said, once you take a look at cloud governance and you actually have visibility into what's in the critical path for your game, and once you generally estimate the CCU that you're expecting and hopefully maybe a lot more than what you're expecting, then the next step is auto scaling, which is a word that I think we've thrown around a couple of times during this episode so far. But just to define it for folks who may not really be aware, it's a way to monitor your applications and automatically adjust any capacity that you need for your backend services to maintain steady, predictable performance, but at the same time optimizing costs, which is really great. I would say that it's very important, if possible, for all of your services to auto scale. And if you have services that can't auto scale, I think it's important to take a long look at why they can't auto scale it and probably document why too, and come up with a backup plan in case they can't. I think auto scaling is really great because it frees up a lot of your developers from taking manual scaling actions, right? So if they need to manually scale up infrastructure before a game launch or event and then manually scale it down, that's a lot of time that they're spending doing scaling and infrastructure scaling rather than feature development that could improve your game and set it apart from others. So I think it's also really cost effective way of managing your infrastructure too. Yeah. And anyone want to jump in?
Are you saying it's a magic service, Gena?
I was saying, is it auto magically scaling? Is that what it is?
Close enough.
Yeah.
I think one thing when we talk about auto scaling, especially in the context of a game launch, is that not all parts of your backend have to scale at the same rate, right? So like doubling the amount of players doesn't necessarily mean doubling the amount of traffic for your backend services. For some, it will be less than that factor of 2. For some, it'll be even more. So kind of going back to testing, it's really good to figure out kind of what those ratios are, right? When you get 2 times the amount of players, do your game servers, does that need to scale up by 2x, or is it 1.5x, or is it 3x? And same thing for each other part. So that's something to really keep in mind, is actually getting some metrics around, okay, how does my backend actually need to respond to this % increase in players, right? And that will help you to actually define those policies on the auto scaling features in the services that you're using, right? At what % utilization do I want to scale up? Because that's going to help you not have any like capacity outages for your backend, because you're setting too small of a threshold, right? And you're only starting to scale once you're at like 90% capacity, when you're getting this huge wave of new players, and you just can't scale up fast enough. So that's something to also be aware of, is like for the backend components that need to scale like 1-to-1 with your player base or even more, setting lower thresholds on that so that you're more sensitive, you're scaling quicker in response to this increased wave of demand.
The other observation that space I've seen with the customers I work with, the marketing team and the product lead on the customer side, they are very, very well versed on the traffic patterns, in influencers, obviously sharing on social media how the product is going to react in the market. They do a lot of market analysis. They partner with firms that do exactly this. So my experience, at least in the last 4 years working with gaming customers, is their projections are almost 95 to 98% spot on. So the chance that it would go more than 10, 15% higher than the projection, at least with my experience, I've seen is almost very low. Like they're 95% to 98% right on how they're projecting what their traffic patterns is going to be on the first week, first day, first 3 days, first week, first month. They have all these metrics. And very rarely we get a sneak peek into those numbers, because obviously that's customer proprietary information, right? But when they do their IEM planning, I think one of us is going to talk about IEM planning, right? So with IEM planning, they do share that numbers with us, and then we start modeling how does that business number translate that to how many services, tier 1 services which are player facing, tier 2 which are not player facing, and how many of the tier 1s need to be scaled up or down based on the patterns. So we're pretty good at that, especially with the IEM exercise and the traffic patterns.
Yeah, I've experienced the flip side of that, where the marketing side of the business is not talking with the infrastructure side of the business, and suddenly
Wait,
infrastructure.
what? What are you talking about?
I've seen this happen. Okay, I see. You're being sarcastic. Okay, that went way over my head, but I'm here now. I'm present. Yeah, it's just wild, and like suddenly there will be like infrastructure will find out a day before that some big event is happening or some big marketing campaign is going on, and they're expected to scale 2x, right? So it really pays to have that auto scaling capability in place beforehand to be able to respond to that in the drop of the hat, unless you're working with Karthik's customers who seem like they're killing it. That's
1
amazing.
year. Our head start is 1 year. They give us the customers we work with, it's a 1 year head start on what's coming down the pipeline, what their projection is, and the market research data. So our our enterprise support team gets a 1 year notice on, hey, we're going to do this thing in the next year. This is the date, and this is our projection. We would love your take on this. So in fact, we are blessed to have such a good customer.
I was going to say, where's the job application? Where do I sign?
Let's talk offline.
And something that I want to go ahead and make sure we reiterate here, right, that Gena brought up several times: document everything. In game development, we're very much used to having a game Bible. The environments, the pitch, the character creation, the entire lore of the world, all of the mechanics and metric. But a lot of times we don't have the same level of documentation for the kind of architecture and usability of the backend of the network piece, because it's always like, well, that's the stuff it's the piping and the plumbing underneath, right? What I care about is getting, the world right. It's like, yes, but if the world doesn't work, then it doesn't matter how right you got the lore if you can't scale to meet demand, if you don't know what to go ahead and look at and measure, if you take certain things for granted. So document everything. The better you become at being diligent about documenting this from the beginning of your development phase all the way through deployment, the better prepared you'll be for when your game is a super success and you need to go ahead and scale up to meet that demand. So yes, document everything. And since we're talking about scaling based on all of that stuff, and including things, metrics like CPU and memory and all of these things, let's talk a bit about some of the services that game developers commonly use that support auto scaling. So do we want to talk a bit about, Elasticache and Dynamo, and who wants to jump in and talk about some of those services?
I can jump in here.
Yes, sir.
So yeah, on-demand auto scaling is something that you tend to see a lot with some of our managed services, right? Things like you mentioned, Elasticache, DynamoDB, Aurora, EC2 being a big one with auto scaling. These are all services that are kind of aware of the traffic. They're aware of the resources necessary to handle a certain level of demand, and will automatically scale themselves to be able to reach that demand, right? This also holds very true for anything that's serverless, that's tagged as serverless. In our systems, they will just take care of scaling for you, and you don't really have to worry about that infrastructure underneath. We'll take care and just make sure that everything works. I want to expand on that, on the idea that, there are some services that this is kind of fully managed for you, which would be serverless, things like Lambda and Dynamo. There are services that are kind of in the middle, like EC2, where you're managing the instances, but you can leverage this other feature called auto scaling, where you can define what it looks like for this service to scale out, how it creates more instances, how it scales both in and out. And then services that don't really have that option, right? Services where you kind of have to tell us ahead of time how many resources you need to be able to support whatever it is that you're doing. There are ways for you to kind of address each of those levels of automation, right? Specifically for the no auto scaling, I think it's important for customers to remember to set a lot of that observability ahead of time. Things like alarms, for example, right? If the system can't scale for you, then you need to be aware of what's going on. You need to set a very early alarm, right? You don't want the alarm to be going off at 90% because then you don't really have time to go and scale things out. You want to set that thing early and often. And then the ability for those alarms.
Look, I like living right on the edge.
Live on the edge,
92%.
Like Austin Powers, I also like to live dangerously.
Everybody loves fighting fires on the weekend, Friday afternoons. It's great.
It's ever on the weekend. It's always at 3 a.m. It's always at 3 a.m.
But the point I'm trying to get to is you want to make sure that those alarms are going off early. And in addition to that, you have to remember that those alarms can trigger other services. And this can be a big deal. Lambda has become my absolute best friend on anything that I do, especially with services that don't auto scale on their own. Because with Lambda, you can have an alarm go off, have that alarm trigger a Lambda that then goes and potentially scales out your service or alerts somebody or spins up some other resource to make sure that your team is not, fighting fires. They're just kind of walking along with the game hand in hand and keeping the resources going rather than fixing things that are already broken. These are some, big things you got to be aware of as you're dealing with these services.
The beautiful side of auto scaling, I think it's a double-edged sword, right? We sure, some of the services definitely help us with auto scale. There's some, even let's say you set some limits, and obviously we have hard limits, right? And Gena, the earlier point on magic services, like in a previous episode, we were talking about one of my mentors in Amazon. One of the first things he taught me when I joined the company was the cloud is not a magic service; it's a managed service. So that's a joke. Sorry.
It is truth. It is not a joke. It is truth.
Preach it.
Preach. So with auto scaling, we have services like, let's say, Dynamo and S3, right? Like they say, hey, we do auto scaling for you. We have provisioned capacity or unprovisioned capacity, which is like, auto scale. But there's always limits to these services, like especially S3. I've come across some teams within the customers we work with where some of them are very knowledgeable on the limits of the service, what are the service quotas. We talked about it, what are the throughput it can handle, what are the TPS it can handle, how many objects of read or write it can handle. Some of them are aware of it, but there are quite a few folks who do assume that, hey, S3, it's, the world, many of the biggest customers in the world who use AWS use S3, so it's a very powerful service. We can throw anything at it. And then when you see some of the service quotas for S3, right, it's not as magical as people think of it. It is, right? It's not. You cannot do million TPS or million writes at S3 through a single set of API calls, right? There are some limits that we need to follow. So with auto scaling, what's happening is it has become a coaching opportunity for us to customers or teams within the customer environment where, hey, like with S3, you need to follow the best practices for S3. You need to follow the best practices for auto scaling for Dynamo. And when we talk to them about how do you do write throughput, read throughput, and how do you manage them, let's say you do have 1 million TPS. How do you do 1 million TPS on S3? We have many re:Invent talks that we've been doing since 2014 on how to build your S3 bucket structure, how to do throughput and proper read and writing on S3. So coaching the customer on true way, the right way of doing auto scaling is something that we definitely, I think we can include in our show notes, right, Chris? We can talk about some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Gena.
I think a key phrase that you said was, we talk to them, right? I think that it's really important if you're planning to do a game launch or a large scale in-game event that you feel comfortable talking to us, right? Like it's our job to help customers excel on AWS. Did somebody want to talk a little bit about how games customers can leverage people like us, their AWS account team, to help them scale?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought, because I was going to say, right, all of the auto magically scaling services don't account for everything. And if you don't know how to leverage those tools and services correctly, right, you could just be left stranded out there not knowing what to do. So the other side of preparing to scale for those types of events are, as Gena just said, talk to your AWS account team so we can help provide the best guidance and recommendations to prepare for scaling when those events happen. So let's go ahead and dig in and talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I'd want to talk about is talk to your account team, and one of probably the big tools that like we have in our tool belt to help customers when they're approaching something like a game launch or a big feature launch is going to be something we've mentioned a few times. We like to call it internally as an IEM. It recently got rebranded as AWS Countdown. But it's essentially a process that we can kick off with you, where we do a deep dive on your architecture, look at the services that you're using, and really engage specialists for each of those to make sure that we're doing that kind of analysis that Karthik was talking about previously with S3. Like, we can do that for each of the services. And, I think my my partners here on the call all are very smart, but we don't know everything. Like, I will be the first to admit, I do not know everything that there is to know about AWS. I don't think anyone in the world does, right? So what that process actually enables us to do is pull in people from the service teams. I've seen this all the time with GameLift, for example, right? Where someone from GameLift will come in and say, okay, how much CCU are you expecting, right? To your best guess. Let's set a high watermark. And then let's look at like API by API, how your game is using the GameLift service. And we can compare that with our best practices on how you should be using each of these APIs to make sure that your traffic is going to properly flow through these APIs, and make sure you're not getting throttled anywhere that you shouldn't be. And this prevents like so many fires during a game launch that you don't want to be dealing with, right? Again, at 3 a.m. So I would say this is one of the first tools and one of the best tools that we have to help you launch your game successfully. The key to it is just approaching us and engaging us as early as possible, right? The more time you give us, if you can give us a year in advance like Karthik's customers do, then fantastic. That's amazing. But the earlier, the better. I think that's really the main takeaway here is engage us early, engage us often. We're here to help. That's literally my entire job.
And we also talked about Trusted Advisor in one of our previous topics, right? So Trusted Advisor is another tool that we have for customers. Like, just as a quick check, sanity check on if all your resources are set up correctly. Do you have any public subnets open to the world or things like that? Like, Trusted Advisor is also the great first step that many customers overlook that part. It's available. It's right there. Just click on it and it's right there for you. It doesn't have to generate anything. It's pre-populated.
And to kind of take that one step even higher, we have the well-architected framework, which is what a lot of these processes are based on, right? Things like Trusted Advisor or the Countdown team. Ultimately, all of this comes from a set of white papers that we have produced that gathers all of the knowledge and experience that we have as solutions architects across 5 different pillars that will help to ensure that your architecture is set up in the best possible way for both security and cost optimization. And that was just my kid coming in, checking in what's going on.
Why is Dad talking in his radio voice?
All right, team. So we've talked about the importance of tagging, the importance of documentation, the importance of correctly estimating as best you can your CCUs and making sure that you are accounting for a number bigger than that. We talked about the importance of setting the right alarms, understanding the type of services that you're operating, and the importance of reaching out to your AWS team to assist you as you're building that back-end scaling for those types of events. So Gena, we know you've had experience in working with some of the largest games customers running on AWS. Without naming names, can you share some insights on how these customers handle CCU scaling on massive games?
Yeah, of course. I don't think it's just me. I think probably pretty much everyone on this call has experience working with big customers, big games customers on AWS, launching large games. But they do a lot of what we've talked about here so far, but just at a very large scale, right? So to include some things that we haven't discussed yet, they get executive sponsorship, right? I think making sure that they have buy-in from their leadership, that this is something that's important to spend time on, is so critical if you want to make sure that you have a successful game launch. They identify service owners, create lists of critical services, right? And write docs. We talked about documentation, but it's true. They write docs and then they spend time going through and reading those docs so that they can make sure all of their engineering team is on the same page when it comes to scaling and preparation for that game launch. And then I think load testing at a massive scale. So live testing is so important. Especially at an unprecedented scale. And it's not just load testing like we've talked about, getting everybody on board and scheduling a load test to make sure that you can accurately capture how much CCU translates to throughput and make sure that all of your services are ready to go for the big day. But it's also live testing with chaos engineering, right? It's making sure that your applications are resilient and fault tolerant. And you can do this with, for example, a service at AWS that we have called fault injection service in production, live testing at scale. And then I also think that monitoring is so important. And this is what a lot of our big customers do today. I mean, we talked a little bit about setting alarms, but I would love to hear maybe from Karthik, for example, about how he finds success with large customers who are monitoring with maybe CloudWatch or Prometheus.
Yeah, with monitoring, it's such a nuanced field in the sense that we come across, even within a single customer, there are teams who are super on board with monitoring every metric, which has its own set of problems. And there's other teams like, what's monitoring? And we have this plethora of situations, even within like very experienced customers, right? The situation is, like I said, a double-edged sword, because customers, especially the ones who, let's say, enable select all for in terms of monitoring, there's so much data coming in, like especially for EC2 instances, like there's like compute, storage, networking, so many other, and many more, right? Like IO requests. There's so many dimensions within EC2 itself. And we have some teams who select all, and they're like, hey, this is so much noise. We don't know which ones to look, which ones to track, which one's important. So the guidance that we give to these customers, all of our AWS services, not almost, but all of our services, we have a blog post or a page in the documentation that says, what are the best practices for monitoring for that services. So the customers know what is the first step, or they can start with that and then fine tune based on their unique requirements. We'll drop a link like for some of the services like EC2, S3, DynamoDB. We'll drop some links in the show notes, but service teams provide that so that you don't have to select all and look at all this volume of data coming in. Mm-hmm. That's on the services side. Now, on databases, the things get even more trickier. So what the pattern that we've observed is customers look at, if my CPU and memory are good, then my database is kind of good, right? And sure, in one dimension, but if you look at the other side where you're looking at number of IO requests, or are your disks getting super, are you hitting the limits of your disks, disk read and write capacity? There's so many other things that many people don't even know they have to monitor those things. And sometimes you will not get a page or an alarm because they're not looking at it. They're just looking at CPU and memory, or they're looking at IO requests. They're looking at it at a network layer, but not at a disk layer. So that's why it goes back to the guidance I was talking about. Like all service teams, they have a best practices page within our documentation. And that's a great place to start looking at things that are the first leg of the race. And then you can add more or delete things that are more unique for your requirements or the customer's requirements.
So we're going to include the monitoring documentation for every single AWS service in the show notes, right?
Absolutely.
Yep, select star monitoring.
Absolutely. Somebody's going to go ahead and start writing those down. Somebody's going to make sure that we have those to provide everybody listening today. And Gene, I love that you mentioned chaos engineering, right? And it also reminds me of, a story that famed game designer Chris Taylor used to say about testing. And he said, what's wonderful is you have your perfect idea of what your players are going to do in the perfect world that you've constructed with the perfect set of rules and the perfect set of mechanics. And then you sit them down in front of it and they go, can I blow that up? How about this? Can I break this thing? Can I do this? And he goes, and everything falls apart because they're all rushing to the walls. But it is absolutely important in doing so, in making sure that you are providing these, you are injecting these sort of anomalies or non-standard sort of behaviors into the game, so you can understand just how fault tolerant your back end is, how your game handles, a massive amount of people, let's say, or players rushing into a particular location. Right? How does your replication stack work? Like all of those different things. So super important as you are not just live testing, but you are making way for those anomalies to kind of present themselves so you can account for them, because they are going to happen in the real world, right?
That's the beauty of games.
That is the beauty of games, right? I love it. Can you break this? Also, can you push that? Of course. Of course.
And Chris, we have customers like who, we have tools like CloudWatch, Prometheus, New Relic, Sumo Logic. There's so many AWS services and AWS partners that provide or operate in the marketing, in the monitoring space. And at least with some of the customers that I work with, Wiz.io is another popular AWS partner that they leverage. And the thing that they like, or why they picked Wiz compared to some of the other offerings in the space, is it shows you this lineage graph or this view from when the CloudTrail log got generated for that API or for that service. And it shows the whole map or the lineage of that call from where it originated to where it ended. And it has plugins so customers can, or people who are tracking, let's say, that part, or they want to take action on a particular invocation, it has plugins built in to click here to open up a Jira ticket for that particular team if it's connected to their Active Directory or AD, Okta AD. So, or it has connection, like if it's a tier 1 service, it has a plugin for PagerDuty, so people can be paged if it's a tier 1 service that's impacting players. There's so much ecosystem built around these monitoring services that it's no longer just a Slack room or a dashboard that somebody has to constantly look at it. Gone are those days. Things are much more interactive, and you can kind of do this event-driven actions that you can do based on what the event source is and things of that nature.
Well, the complexity of this apparently scared Gabe, because now we only have the top of his eyes there. So, Gabriel, you may want to move your camera down so we can see your face, buddy. Hey, there we go. Now we got him back. All right. So yes. Sorry, didn't mean to go ahead and derail that last comment, but great advice though, Karthik. Great advice. Awesome. And look, another word of advice I would give to anybody listening to this, right? If the one word that I can use to sum all of this up is plan. Plan for your game to be a breakout success, right? If your game relies heavily on multiplayer or online services, building a plan for scaling before you go live is absolutely critical, because if you're looking to scale after demand to do so has happened, while it's still achievable, it becomes a critical issue that takes more time, cost, and places stress on the team and players, all of which can result in a negative impact on your game's studio reputation and player trust. So AWS can help you navigate those waters to ensure that you can meet the player demand for your awesome game. And I want to thank my co-hosts today, Gena, Dominic, Karthik, and Gabriel. And if there is a topic you would like to see us cover on future episodes of Boss Level, make sure you leave a comment in the section below. And as always, we'll place all the links to the services, technology, and guidances that we mentioned in today's episode in the show notes below. So until next time, thank you so much. Good luck on your cloud game development journey. Know that AWS is here to support you. And thanks to my co-host today for a great episode of Boss Level. Thanks, gang.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.